Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our report back section. Before we start, let's enjoy a 2-minute conference video.
A lot can happen in a year. And in a world 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer than it was 200 years ago, things tend to happen in record-breaking extremes. 2017 was the hottest year on record without an El Niño. In Hong Kong, it was the third warmest since 1884. And across the world, unprecedented monsoon rains and floods. Wildfires swept across the Amazon. Typhoons and hurricanes punished Pacific and Atlantic coasts. The human toll and destruction of property had been devastating. Hong Kong was not spared. Super Typhoon Hato was one of the most intense to hit in years, and it wreaked havoc across the region. 10 deaths in Macau. Households plunged into darkness. Businesses and public transport were brought to a standstill. Extreme climate events have not let up in 2018. Floods in Japan, hurricanes in the Americas, in southern China and the Philippines, there was Super Typhoon Mango. As global temperatures and sea levels continue to rise, scientists are predicting stronger storms in the coming decades. The events of 2017 and 2018 are giving us a taste of what's to come, and they hold many lessons for cities on how to address their vulnerabilities. The discussions need to begin now. October 27th to 29th, climate experts, policymakers, business and industry leaders from across the region and around the world will meet in Hong Kong for CARe2018, Climate Adaptation and Resilience Hong Kong Conference. The objectives? To spearhead discussion on how cities and regions can become more climate resilient, explore new multidisciplinary policies, the public and private infrastructure investments needed, as well as best practices for governments and communities. 3 panels, 4 workshops, 1 weekend. We need your voice. Join us now and be part of the discussion.
Good morning. Thank you very much for being here. And I know a few of you have actually spent the whole of Saturday and Sunday with us. We couldn't do a feedback to everybody that came because we wanted to have an opportunity to do the wrap-up after we really wrapped up yesterday and to try and do it in Central so that we also have a chance to brief people in the private sector, in the community sector, and in the government sector. So thank you very much for being with us today. So today is a quick feedback of what happened over 1.5 days. Actually, it was over 2 days. And we're taking a bit of a risk because usually everything is organized way ahead of time. So there is no... organization is good. But sometimes it loses that organic developmental nature that happens as things happen. So what we did yesterday after the workshops were over is that only then did we put the presentation together for you today. So not sure whether you've heard that the IPCC actually has come up with a special report. This is definitely worth reading. There is a summary for decision makers. So if you haven't looked at this, it is online. This is what it looked like at the plenary. On a Saturday morning, we had 500 people with us, which was quite extraordinary. So I think we can dispel with the concern that Hong Kong people don't know or don't care enough about climate change. I think there is a solid group of people from the community who cares. We also had 4 workshops, and some of the issues we discussed was how do we understand climate change from the perspective of adaptation and resilience. So we wanted to talk about how extreme is extreme. You'll hear from a number of scientists later on how to look at the extreme. Of course, it has to do with our physical assets. What are we concerned about in Hong Kong? And whilst we won't go into the details here, at the conference we identified what are Hong Kong's key infrastructure from the perspective of the government. But that doesn't mean it includes everything from the private sector. So that needed to be added in. But also, even at a community level, if you live in a particular district, something may not be a citywide essential infrastructure, but it might be critical in your district. So having an understanding of what are the assets overall in the city as well as down to a district level is also very important. And then planning and design assumptions. How do you understand what the shocks might be? So clearly we need more discussions about these areas. Now, while sometimes talking about climate change is all about doom and gloom, but actually there are also some opportunities for us to do things better. We need knowledge, we need to collaborate, but also it is an opportunity for the community to come together by itself with the stakeholders and with government. So we can see this as an opportunity to bring the community together. Adaptation, very expensive worldwide, and it'll be very expensive for many places around the world. I'm going to ask our scientists who worked in the workshops. We'll start talking about heat and drought. We'll talk about the risk of increased precipitation. Sea level rise is already happening. Storm surges is real. And there are also oceans-related issues that is not enough understood. So we also very briefly want to introduce oceans-related issue. Then landslides. Hong Kong has a lot of mountainsides. Very critical that we're able to manage this well. You might remember this. There are other shocks that are not necessarily physical in nature, but they have a tremendous impact on communities. Food, water, the security of your electricity. If we don't have any one of these, communities are at huge risk. We also want to remember vulnerable communities, in particular, when we have these shocks. Finance, who's going to pay for things? And also philanthropy, because philanthropy can help us in the early days in areas that we may not completely understand yet to help us trigger some early responses. So I'm going to stop here now and hand over to our first speaker, Ruby.
All right, thank you. So at this workshop, we have about a total of 15 presentations by different scientists. And so we talk about extreme events. And of course, the first question is, why would extreme events change with a warming climate condition? Right. So I'd like to very briefly talk to you about 3 different aspects of extreme events and why they might change. So first of all, we know that global warming will cause a warmer temperature over land. And land is important because land is where we live, right? So because of the warmer temperature over land, we expect to have more hot extremes over land. And secondly, because of the warmer temperature, we also expect the atmosphere to be more humid. And because of the increase in humidity, we also expect stronger summer as well as winter storms. And then lastly, the warmer temperature is not only affecting the warming over land, but also over the ocean as well. So because of the warmer ocean, we also expect to have more intense typhoons. So I'm going to elaborate a little bit more for you in different aspects of these 3 type of extreme events. So in terms of heat waves, hotter extremes, so we know that simply by increasing the temperature, for example, shifting to the right-hand side, you would expect that the tail, the really extreme part of the temperature would increase more than the average. And indeed, what we found, for example, over southern China, looking at heat waves in the past from the 1980 to 2010, so you can see that heat waves are already happening more often. Not only more often, but they also happen earlier in the year. So you can see the beginning of heat waves to be starting in the past, maybe more like July 1st. And now they're starting more like in June, as well as the whole season for heat waves to happen also extend into the later part of the year in September versus in the 1980s, it was more like in August. So we have already seen these kind of changes happen in South China. And so projecting into the future, we look at hot nights. So hot nights are nights when the temperature is above 28 degrees. And then hot days are days when the daytime maximum temperature is above 33 degrees. So projecting into the future from the 80s, the current climate condition to the mid-century, to the end of the century, you can see an increase in hot nights as well as an increase in the hot days. So these are important for us to recognize because there are impacts of these kind of heat conditions. So Hong Kong has experienced warmer nights and warmer days. But in urban areas, we have lots of urban areas. So what scientists found is that in urban areas, during nighttime, it's actually very difficult to cool down because of the warmer temperature. You have to turn on the air conditioning, so you are producing anthropogenic heat, as well as the type of materials in urban areas are different. So having really warm nighttime temperature is critical. So here in this figure, you can see with an increase in the temperature, we also see increase in the mortality rate. And this increase is different for different cities. In Hong Kong, this is 1.5% per degree of warming. Yeah. So not only that temperature is expected to change, but we also see that rainfall has changed in the past as well. So this figure shows you from the 1880s all the way to 2010, because the Hong Kong Observatory has kept a really good record of hourly rain rate. And so you can see that in the past, we don't often see a breaking record. We don't often see a breaking record of hourly rainfall. So not very often you would see breaking record, but in the last 20, 30 years or so, we see much more often breaking record of hourly rainfall with 2008, a really severe increase in the hourly rainfall to 145.5 millimeter. And so that event also not only broke the hourly rainfall record, but also broke the 2-hour rainfall record as well. I see. Okay. All right. So, and then projecting into the future, scientists have looked into this, and they found that, especially in the summertime, there are lots of convective rainfall. In Hong Kong is the same way. So we expect to see more frequent these kind of big mesoscale convective storms. Not only that they are happening more often in the future, but we expect them to be also happening with the size of these storms would be increasing. So that means that they would be affecting a larger area with more intense precipitation. So lastly, we also worry about typhoons, right? So in Hong Kong, I mean, this is the record between 1975 to 2015. Of course, typhoons make landfalls in Hong Kong. So you can see an increase in the peak intensity already, even in the historical record. And scientists expect typhoons to continue to increase in terms of intensity because the primary source of energy for typhoons are coming from the ocean. So if we got a warmer ocean, we expect that the typhoons will be getting stronger. So it's very important knowing that all these different types of extreme events will be getting more frequent as well as more intense, and that we need to work together, improve communication, improve coordination. So this is an example of Hurricane Sandy making landfall in the Manhattan area. So during that time, you can see the blackout of a large area, and people had to work together. So it involves medical professionals, transportation, and all kinds of areas. So it is important for communication and for coordination. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ruby. A lot of science work have been done, but obviously ongoing work is still necessary. The Hong Kong Observatory is the government's climate science authority, and it continues to do really excellent work. So I think the point that we want to make here is there is a lot of data. I mean, obviously, there's more work that still needs to be done because the climate is changing. So we know it's changing. How we think it might change and continue to understand the changes that are taking place, it's essential. But the information that is already available, it's really important that the scientists are able to work with people in the community. So if you think this kind of data might be useful for you in your work, we would love to work with you at HKUST and in the other universities here that have worked on the data. So let me introduce the next speaker, Professor Zhang.
I'm here, yeah. Good morning, everyone. So I'm reporting on the work group 3A, managing sea level, so based on the 3 presentation. So obviously, this sea level rise is a global phenomenon. We need to understand all the process contributing to this global and the regional sea level rise. So basically, something can happen within the ocean, such as this global warming and the ocean warming causes the sea level expand. So that's called the thermal expansion. But also the ocean interact with the other component, like the melting from the ice sheet and the mountain glacier can adding the new water into this ocean. So basically, that's the second item there. This slide is slightly different. But anyway, yeah. So basically, the other thing is that whatever happened within the ocean, there's a kind of echo maybe here. Yeah, whatever happened within the ocean can redistribute this sea level, such as the ocean circulation. And also, another phenomenon is not well known to the ocean and the climate community. It's called the fingerprint. So basically, whatever change like in the land ice can cause a unique like a fingerprint. So later I'm going to explain a little bit more about that. And also there's the vertical land motion, so associated with the global phenomenon called the glacier isostatic adjustment. So basically that's a response to the last glacier like a maximum, but locally can also have some like a groundwater depletion called the vertical land motion. So basically you need to consider all those processes to be able to understand and explain the global and the regional sea level change. And for any sea level study, you need to consider the total sea level and also the sum of the individual contribution. You can see whether you can close the budget. And also, for this type of study, it's IPCC, on a global and regional large-scale study. But it's very tricky right now to understand how the open ocean signal propagated to the coastal. So this is still a challenging task to understand the regional sea level change and the coastal impact. So that's the reason the World Climate Research Program to list this one as one of the ground challenges to address in the coming decades. Oh, sorry, yeah. So obviously, we want to look at some observation about this sea level, change. So on the left shows the global mean sea level starting from 1700 up to the 2100. So it's a kind of merge of different data. So in the beginning, it's based on some reconstruction. So obviously, in the first 200 years, relatively is flat the sea level. And then starting from 1900, you can see the sea level is, started to rise. And also you can, if just by visual check, you find the rising rate is become faster and faster. So this is one called acceleration. So in particular, in the recent 20 years, we have satellite. We found that the rising rate is talking about over 3 millimeters per year. I think Hong Kong also experiencing something very similar. So from the early 2000 year, we have the projection up to the 2100. So you can see by the end of this century, we are talking about maybe between half meter and 1 meter sea level rise. And Hong Kong also get a very similar projection number. But that's the result from the IPCC AR5 that's published about 5 years ago. And in the recent, very recently, we had some new development in the sea level community. For example, on the right is this new result from DeCondo and Pollard. They use some new mechanism for the Antarctic ice sheet, so they get this much larger projection up to the 2500. So basically, you can see the projection there is talking about between 10 to 15 meters from Antarctic ice sheet alone. So it's quite scary. And we need to understand whether whether it's possible or not. The reason why there's uncertainty on those Antarctic projections is because we don't have very good observation. So until very recently, we have some satellite measurement. So on the left shows this Antarctic map. So basically, the reddish color means that the Antarctic is losing the mass. So basically, it's only in the West Antarctic. But for the East Antarctic, it's a gain mass. So rather than melting, but it's in fact it got more accumulation. So this uneven distribution we can understand only because of this global like a good coverage through the satellite measurement. On the right is Greenland, kind of like a melting map in the recent like 1 or 2 decades. So because of this satellite measurement, so hopefully we can continue such like a global measurement. Then we can do a better job to understand and simulate contribution from those ice sheets. And here, in the bottom shows the contribution to the global mean sea level from those polar ice sheets, and in comparison to this mountain glacier. So you can see the contribution from the glacier is higher than the polar ice sheet. But in the future, there's a huge potential. Talking about maybe several meter contribution from the polar ice sheets. So in the beginning, I mentioned that there's a kind of fingerprint to go with any melting. So this one is a relatively new kind of development in the sea level research field. This one is not coming from the ocean field. In fact, it's from the geodesy field. So basically, you need to consider 3 factors. Like one is called gravitational attraction. The other is elastic response of the solid Earth, and also rotation of this Earth. So basically, put it very simple. So the melting of the Greenland, as an example here, so cause the sea level in the near field, near the melting source, but the sea level rising in the far field. So this one definitely is against the intuition, but that's the kind of robust solution from the geodesy. So basically, put it in a simple way is that for the melting in the Greenland, the Hong Kong area, going to experience more sea level rise than Boston. So it's definitely a new thing to consider. So it's rather than say we are far away from those ice sheets, maybe we are in a safe zone, but in fact not. It's we are going to experience a little bit more than the other region. So obviously, in addition to the mean sea level rise, there are many factors can cause sea level change, and in particular something associated with like extreme like a weather event, and as mentioned, the hurricane, or typhoon by previous speaker. So we have the storm surge can also cause a huge change in the sea level within a short time period. So basically here shows the reason caused like a storm surge due to this typhoon. So basically the dominant feature is talking about this lower pressure in the atmosphere called sucking up of the water, but also on the right shows that this piling up of the water due to high wind. So that's the 2 dominant feature to cause like a storm surge related to the hurricane. And this is one example from a very recent like a typhoon Mangut. So basically shows this surge from the the real data, and then in compared to this forecast a few days ago. So fortunately, the reality is lower than the what's the forecast. And the previous owner already mentioned about this typhoon in the Hong Kong region. In fact, we are this like based on the data starting from 1975, we have a increase of the typhoon like intensity. So this one is associated with the warmer like ocean temperature. So basically, from this intensified typhoon, we are going to experience a little bit more like extreme event like a storm surge, but also rising this mean sea level can make such an event more likely. So there are 2 factors to be considered talking about any future storm surge. So obviously, for sea level rise, we need to consider some of the adaptation, options. So basically, we can put it into 3 categories. First is about retreat, maybe just move back from the beach. But usually, people don't want to move. They want to stay with the like a beach house. They don't want to like move away. So the second one is do some accommodation by elevate your property. And then the third one is to do some protection. For example, by building some seawall. And one thing is a relatively new development. It's like maybe kind of in the accommodation category. It's maybe can think about go floating because the Netherlands is recently developed some new idea. So for example, here is a floating apartment. because sea level is going to rise anyway. So maybe we have to thinking about a new idea. But in fact, it's not very new. In fact, thinking about Seattle, they have a boathouse, for many decades. So there are some older technique and also new technique. Maybe we can think about in this direction. And obviously, for any like a weather, climate event, we can think about the risk. So this risk obviously is a function not just of the exposure, but also function of vulnerability. So basically, if the one city or one region is well prepared, so basically you can reduce the vulnerability. So one example is from Macau and Hong Kong in the recent 2 typhoon. So for the Hato, the death toll, it's 12 in Macau. But in the similar, typhoon, it's reduced to 0. So basically, because the city, have a much better preparedness, so the vulnerability is much reduced. So although it's the exposure is similar, but the vulnerability is much reduced. So you need to consider, both factors. So in this case, maybe thinking about the World Bank recently ranked the Great Bay Area as a high risk. So maybe we can think about whether it's a fair, estimate. So from the exposure part, yes, this region, had a huge, exposure due to substantial, asset and population. But thinking about the vulnerability, in fact, Hong Kong relatively have very good preparedness. So in some sense, the risk is not as high as, just if you just consider the exposure thing. So basically, some key points from our workshop. So basically, sea level sea level rise is accelerating and will continue for centuries. And we found that for the storm surge associated with the typhoon, it's one factor we need to consider. And unfortunately, the typhoon can significantly impact Hong Kong, and they're likely to become intense and carry more rain as the climate warms. And Hong Kong did very good in the preparedness, and for example, very low damage from a recent like a typhoon. But what's enough today may not be good enough, in the future. So we need to do a little bit more action. For example, raise the public awareness and the natural disaster emergency preparedness, and do some cross-disciplinary collaboration, and also. We should thinking about the resilience should be central to the infrastructure design and operation, so the system can quickly resume operation after extreme weather event. And also, we in the workshop we discussed about some factors. Failure across the system can be highly nonlinear, and sometimes it's difficult to predict. So every time you have some new problem. So basically, it's critical to establish early warning systems. So basically, enhance the monitoring and do the rapid analysis, and and learn from small failures. So. And also, we found that the adaptation does not need to be very expensive. Sometimes need to be smart, well planned, and coordinated. So thank you.
Professor Zhang, thank you very much. Our next presentation is going to be about landslides and storm surge, and also the ocean. So, Robert. Oh.
I'm not landslides.
Oh, who's doing not landslide? I mean,
Okay.
It is.
Hi.
Yes.
So actually, it should be Professor Gan here, but he unfortunately couldn't come today. So I'm going to talk. And firstly, we had 2 really good presentations, one from the Environmental Protection Department and one from Agricultural Food Conservation Department, telling us about where Hong Kong is today. And then we had Professor Dai from Xiamen University and Professor Gan talking about the future issues. So on the Environmental Protection Department, Tony ran through how they have the ordinances which mandate them to look at what are the good things that can come from having good water quality, and then setting standards to meet that, and the progress that has been made, firstly in terms of monitoring our waters well, secondly all the work that's been done over the last 20 years in terms of improving the sewage treatment. So now 93% of Hong Kong's population, the sewage is properly treated in main system. And then for industrial and commercial, how every premise which has significant outputs must be licensed, and those licenses can require retreatment. So I think a lot has been done, and it was very well presented. And then Agricultural Fisheries and Conservation Department talked about fish, how fish is an important part of our diet. Globally, it's 27%. Hong Kong's a higher percentage than that. But we have very little of the fish we eat comes from our own waters. And one of the things that AFCD has been tasked to do is to look at how we could improve and increase the amount of aquaculture which we have. And the ideas include that we should move to offshore areas where it's deeper water. This little video you can see is a fish cages which are much more typhoon proof. This particular video was taken during Typhoon Hato. It's nearby off Zhuhai, I think. It's not in Hong Kong waters. But if we have fish cages like this, we have them in deeper water, and then we move away from the trash fish to having food pellets. Much more can be done, and maybe we can have a really good sector of the economy there. Then Professor Dai and Professor Gan talked about the project which they're working on together, which goes under the name Ocean Hong Kong. And it looks at the changes that are coming in the future due to climate change, due to the increased level of pollutants which are coming into the waters around here. And one of the issues, as you will see here, is hypoxia, the depletion of oxygen in the water, which causes dead zones, is starting to get much higher in the area between Hong Kong and Macau. And on current trends, it's not a significant problem today, but on current trends, it could become a really significant problem. So just running through what are the issues. So hypoxia, this depletion of oxygen, which can cause dead zones of the dying. About 65% of the cause is due to fertilizer runoff, and about 35% is on sewage. And hypoxia leads to what we know as red tides. And red tides, they're decreasing in frequency here, but they're increasing in severity and how long they're carrying on for. So it is an issue which needs to be worked on. Another issue is generally global warming. Every 1 degree centigrade we get an increase in the water temperature, we get a 2% drop in its oxygen carrying content. And acidification, as carbon dioxide dissolves in water, it forms carbonic acid. The water gets more acidic. It becomes more difficult for marine organisms to form their shells and their skeletons. And finally, changing ocean currents. This one is an area which is still tentative research, but as the world warms, the polar regions warm faster than the equator. And this could have an impact on ocean currents, which could lead to a reduction in the flow of nutrients and sort of water from the Pacific through the Luzon Strait into the South China Sea, and a reduction in the fish catch in the South China Sea. So we need action in terms of better understanding, better monitoring of our waters, a better understanding of the mechanisms to determine the extent to which the eutrophication, hypoxia, and acidification are going to happen. We need to look elsewhere for lessons. The San Francisco Bay Area is a good example where they have been working on these problems very well for a long time. And we need to plan at an ecosystem level. Just sort of saying we're going to sort out Hong Kong waters without cooperation across the border obviously doesn't work. The fish don't recognize the border. We require cooperation both between the government departments and with the other authorities in the Greater Bay Area. Thank you very much.
Sea level rise. Sea level rise. Anthony?
Right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Anthony, faculty member in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering in HK UST. So I'm here to report back our workshop about excess water challenges. So before I talk, I would just like to show you a video first.
바로 앞에 있던 차량들이 순식간에 사라졌습니다.
So I couldn't translate it, but you could see probably what happened.
여씨는 급히 제동 장치를 밟았고.
So that is in Taiwan, very close to us. Another landslide. Okay, so we have a lucky guy over there. Yeah. Wow, scary, huh? So similar event is like a mud flow in the state. So basically the whole village has been flushed during excess rainfall. And probably you could recognize this 10 years ago, we have a severe debris flow happening in the Lantau Island. So that is the access, the only access to our international airport. So after this event, the whole highway has been blocked by 16 hours. Pretty scary. So what does that mean about excess water? So from the previous presentation about from the climate researchers, we know rainfall is going to be increasing in the future. So what does that mean to us? Landslide density will be increasing. That's the statistics provided by our colleague in Geotechnical Engineering Office in CDD. So that's the prediction. And we also have academics in HKUST doing the prediction of what happened under the climate change scenarios. And this is the western part of the Hong Kong Island. As you can see, these little tails here are representing the debris flow event under some sort of climate change scenario. So we don't only have the landslide events, but also flooding. As you can see, the blue areas, those are the potential flooding areas in our future. So that is not only happening in Hong Kong, but also in the Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau Bay area. So from the statistics from our insurers, Swiss Re, they show that this is the #1 risk population in this area with storm surge, and also the flood. So that is not only happening in Hong Kong, but in a greater Bay Area as well. So we also have colleagues from the Drainage Services Department sharing their current technology in Hong Kong. So they have a very innovative approach. So they are trying to build a spongy city. So by building this kind of blue-green infrastructure to adapt that kind of climate change future regarding flooding through different mechanisms, as you can see, okay? So we also have speakers from GEO, the Geotechnical Engineering Office, sharing the current smart approaches to sort of communicate with the community about the debris flow event. So this is what they call a debris impact switch. So we have a check dam to collect the debris material. So there's a sensor sending message to the mobile app, so to warn the system. So this is still under research. It's a collaboration with HKUST, with the GEO. So can we do better? So those are the existing technologies. So we have ongoing research on developing more adaptive infrastructure for landslide. So this is one technology, they call it flexible barrier system. So basically it's the steel wire to collect the debris. So the HKUST colleagues have built a long flume. Okay, so by collaborating with the University of Hong Kong Kadoorie Center, so they built around 30-meter long flume. So what they did is, here I show you some video. So that is a video showing looking upstream. So basically we collect a debris and then we open the check, and then where is it? Okay, so no, not this one first. Look at that one. So debris coming down. So if you look downward, you then see the debris going through. So you see the piling up of the debris because of the flexible barrier. And if you look at the right-hand side here, so the debris is coming down, and we have one layer of flexible barrier, another one. So if you can see here, we are trying to minimize this runoff distance, which is very important because in Hong Kong, we are very densely populated. The infrastructure is very close to hill. So if we can minimize this runoff distance, then we can save lots of life. So this barriering system seems to work quite well, and that's the recent research. And we also have speakers from overseas, in the UK particular, from University of Sussex, which is Professor Michael Davis' work, which is in the audience here. So he has a very innovative or ecologically friendly approach to stabilize slope using vegetation. So these are the root systems. So why don't we utilize this root as an engineering materials or engineering structures to stabilize the slope? So this is one thing we could probably learn from the overseas. So challenges is about materials, and then systems are deteriorating with time. So even though we build something new today, the performance increase. But as the time goes, perhaps due to the environmental loading, because of the climate change, things deteriorate. Okay, so it may drop below the performance level. Okay, so what does that mean? So even we build a very perfect system today, after 50 years, the system may deteriorate, just like your photocopier in your office. If you utilize it a lot, it deteriorates, then you need to replace it. So what does that mean? So for the increased rainfall, we have challenges. We need to improve our adaptive system for this kind of events. Okay, so it's quite challenging in terms of research to predict where and when that failure will happen with time. Okay, so this required a lot of research in understanding the interaction between climate, soil, and also possibly the vegetation. So it's a cross-disciplinary research. So the next step here is we are trying to collaborate quite a lot with engineering, the government departments, including the HKO. So we are trying to develop a research project looking into more details, using more latest advanced technology like the AI, the machine learning. So we try to collect the historic data to predict better what happened in the future, and then develop our physical infrastructure more adaptive. So I would like to end my presentation by sharing one of the slides provided by the GEO colleague. So it's not only engineering job, but it's collaboration with all these parties to make our city more resilient. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I think this was a really, really quick snapshot of what the experts and the scientists are able to do. And you can see this kind of work is only possible if we have a number of disciplines working together. And of course, the government departments are extraordinarily important. And we have the director of drainage services. He keeps everything not flooded. He keeps the sewage going to the right place. We have the water supplies department also with us. The fact that every day you get water pumped up to wherever you are, that's really an extraordinary achievement in Hong Kong. And we have CEDD here, who's the government engineering department, and they are working very hard to kind of keep everything going. Now, one of the key messages that you could say is part of the takeaway. Can you go back to my original part 2? The issue is, having talked for a day and a half, we also found that there are certain cross-cutting issues, and you've already heard some of them going forward. Keep going, keep going. No, keep going, just, yeah. All right. You've already heard really some of the issues. There are certain areas of improvement that we all need to make. So first of all, if I can summarize what really everybody agreed on, we have to practice integrated and systems thinking. The complexity that Anthony has just showed you, and the complexity of taking the science that the scientists are doing, working together with the engineers, working together with government departments. How do we blend in the thinking, the knowledge, and always going forward, thinking about the future? This kind of systems thinking and practicing it in departments, in your own organization, as well as with your key stakeholders is very important. In order to do this really well, or better and better, in order to keep up with the sort of extreme climate, we need to, in fact, increase our climate literacy. And this is not just for the experts, because the experts work in the community. They have to work with other stakeholders, the public, the politicians, their bosses, who are not necessarily all technical people. They need money to do this. So the financiers, we need to therefore increase the climate literacy across our different institutions, and also our capacity to understand and act. One of the great statements that came out of our plenary session on Saturday was, just because everybody's very excited about something doesn't mean you know what to do. So it is very important for us to educate ourselves and to work with each other, to have the capacity to act. Now, improving communication, especially in how we prepare for an emergency. And then when the emergency is about to happen, for example, if there's a big, great typhoon coming, Hong Kong is pretty good because we've had to deal with typhoon year after year. But with Mangkhut, we realized that there are still some gaps. So it's about continuous learning. In fact, I think in the government, after Hato, there was a lot of intense discussion about what to do next. And with Mangkhut, I think the defense in Hong Kong was quite good, but even there, we noticed that there are some new lessons we need to learn. So communicating, improving that communication, bringing more people into that's very important. And there is one issue we really want to highlight, and that is de-risking. In a sense that when people need, well, I think I don't need to tell you, you're all at management level. Taking decisions sometimes to do something new or to do something different, it's kind of risky. How can we develop a kind of culture of learning, but de-risking the political risk? And when I say political risk, I don't just mean in the Legislative Council where people complain, but even within an institution, in your department, in your company, in your, whatever institution you're working in, how can we de-risk that sense of maybe we don't want to change? Because when we're facing some new risks, some of these climate risks, we hardly understand fully. So it's very important for us to develop a kind of less blame culture where we can co-learn together because we don't know everything. And when some severe event happens, it could be extremely horrifying. So how do we build that culture? So these were the cross-cutting issues that everybody talked about. So, this is a summary. How do we talk to each other? Better deliberation. Before we can make decisions, we need to deliberate. We need to have the right facts. We need to understand what the risks are. We need to understand what's the level of risk we can accept as an organization, as a community. These are all really quite complex issues. And as a society, we need to discuss them. Resilience. Again, we're talking about the resilience of many different systems. We wanted to highlight especially areas that are really important to all of us: the critical infrastructure for electricity, for our gas, for our water supplies, for our food. These are all very critical issues. How well are the resilient system? So these are things we need to talk about over time. Oh, the words, there we go. Does anybody recognize what this picture is about, especially that one on top? Well, it's about a bus. That is a branch coming through the bus. So one of the issues that we talked about a lot after Mangkhut is the amount of vegetation there is. But one of the things that happened was, the branches that sticks out on our mountainside. There are issues that can penetrate the windows of our buses. So one of the things that we talked about earlier already is just being more careful with certain things. Adaptation and resilience does not always mean major engineering infrastructure. We just need to understand where some of the risks are, and it doesn't cost that much to deal with them. So again, just to remind ourselves, Hong Kong is a great city. There are 7.5 million of us here, but certain of the things that could be presented by climate change affects not just us, but our entire region. The risk can be national even. So again, if we start to think a little bit more about the extensiveness of climate risk is different from some other kinds of risk, but it can exacerbate other types of risk. So we also talked a little bit about having these kinds of discussions. It could be top-down, but it could also be bottom-up. It isn't all about government doing everything. The response from the community, from other groups, is very important, and we saw this. So people talked about the kind of new discussions that people need to have, more multi-agency collaboration within the government and discussion with the major infrastructure stakeholders. The stakeholders themselves could be having new conversations with each other. Obviously, we need to bring our legislature and our local councillors on side so they understand what could be happening. The education sector, including the universities, how can we be a part of that discussion? Because in our institution, there is a lot of rich data and knowledge. The built environment professionals. We are a city of buildings and infrastructure. That particular profession, extraordinarily important. We have many, many companies here that deals with infrastructure all along the chain, from property developers to architects to planners to landscape architects to building managers and so on, electricians, right? You know, all the people that are necessary to keep this city running. How can they also have more extensive discussion? And finance and insurance. Things cost money. Insurance, how do we understand how that might go forward in the future? We already briefly touched on philanthropy and the community sector, the NGOs. One point that we do want to press is climate change requires different professions to actually have more knowledge. We need to retool ourselves, that as we think about the qualifications for the different professions, perhaps climate change is something we all need to know better. What kind of platforms? How are we going to talk about these areas? Where do we talk about them? There was one sense coming through from everybody in the community to really talk about, can we have new institutions to talk? But as we reflected on this after the conference, we realized that actually there are many existing bodies already in Hong Kong. How can we use these existing bodies to have these conversations that everybody wants? And, you know, here's just a few examples. Council of Sustainable Development. This is a government body. We have the University Government and Industry Consortium of Sustainable Urban Development. But this is not working very well right now, but it could be revived. It could be re-energized so that we can have these cross-sector discussions. We have many professional bodies. Institute of Engineers, Institute of Planners, of Architects, Green Building Council. We have many of these bodies, and many of you are here today. How can we use these bodies to increase our climate literacy? We have the Hong Kong Foundation Exchange, which is a body, memberships are the philanthropic foundations. How can we get them also engaged in thinking about philanthropy, how philanthropy can help to stimulate the early opportunities for doing certain things in the community? We have the Hong Kong Green Finance Association, a new body. Again, there, how can the financial sector be a part of this discussion? We have the Hong Kong Quality Assurance Agency that has developed standardization, certification of green bonds. Can they also be asked to think about how to certify other types of green new products? So these are some of the things that we discussed. So perhaps I'll just stop here and invite Jim McGuire to come and give us a very quick summary of some of the issues that we discussed about the financial sector.
Thank you very much. As you can imagine, spending all day Saturday and a Sunday morning talking about finance and insurance, what I'm going to report back on was some pretty robust discussions. We had academics, we had financial investors, insurance practitioners, and consultants in the room. And I think the key thing, what we called our session, was the climate finance and green insurance session. And we weren't short on ambition. The discussion about what should be the priority of this was not just Hong Kong. A lot of discussion on the Greater Bay Area and how we are inextricably linked into the Pearl River Delta. The innovation, the investment going in there, and how we as Hong Kong can support driving new financial models and new insurance models. The scale of the challenge is significant. There's been numbers up here. Bloomberg has some pretty staggering numbers that they use when they call their new energy outlook 2 degrees. They talk about $12.1 trillion out to 2040, about $450 billion US a year. But for some of you who are in the room, when Professor Ma spoke at the Green Finance Association launch, he talked about China having a $650 billion US opportunity in green finance. From the insurance side, what we discussed was what are the new models from a financial risk management instrument perspective that we can introduce, that we can bring into Hong Kong, but we can also then take into the region, if not globally. And that's in and around weather hedges, it's in and around cat bonds, it's in and around public-private partnerships that engage capital markets, government, as well as the insurance sector to provide disaster risk financing, disaster risk management, and insurance. It's being done all over the world, through the Caribbean into South and Southeast Asia. We need to do or introduce that concept here in Hong Kong. From a financial services perspective, a lot of discussion about mobilizing capital. Private capital, public capital, philanthropic capital. Capital that is catalytic early stage versus capital that is more long-term investor. And a lot of discussion in our group about the role of government, where government can fit in as an enabler, as a guarantor of last resort, as first loss capital, as a risk-sharing participant. And I think the consensus was, interestingly enough, with a number of students in the room, the idea of climate finance, the idea of green insurance, ultimately we came to a long and robust discussion on where's the career path, where can we go, where can we take this? In Hong Kong, we've got a lot of existing resources and subject matter expertise when we look at insurance, when we look at financial services, green bonds, green loans, etc. And the idea is how to take that to the next level through education, through engagement with academia, with government, but with the capital providers, both direct capital, equity and debt, but also the insurance industry, which represents contingent capital. And I'll stop there.
Energy, water, food, really, really important. And we had Deepak Sharma from Australia, who's doing some very sophisticated and interesting work. And I thought, Deepak, maybe you can just share some insights with us.
Thank you. This is another issue we discussed at some length over the last day and a half. And the main points arising from our discussion are the following. Climate change poses a significant threat to energy, food, water security, economic prosperity, and social stability. Effective policy responses and institutional structures and mechanisms will therefore be required to contain this threat. The effectiveness of these policies and institutional structures, we believe, will depend on the extent to which we can inform their design by nexus considerations. Why? Because energy, food, water, economic, social, cultural, geostrategic, and other spheres of our lives are deeply interconnected. Our understanding of these interconnections and our ability to articulate them into the design of policies and institutional structures will therefore determine the success we are likely to achieve in redressing the climate change challenge in a balanced manner. There's a considerable work and effort that's currently underway in several countries around the world on this theme, how to take this idea to the next stages. And we do hope that Hong Kong, which has shown exemplary leadership in so many policy areas, will embrace this concept with equal enthusiasm. There's a lot at stake, but we remain hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepak. We talked about what a resilient city is like. And it's not just about the hardware, it's got to be about the software and about the people. So I'd like to invite Andy Lipkis, who's done a lot of work in Los Angeles, to bring people together to say a few words.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. There's talk about top-down, which has been most of what we've discussed this morning. You've seen the words bottom-up. This is where it gets real. It gets real for each and every person in this room, because we all live here. Most of us live here. Over 7 million people who could be victims or could be rescuers. The definition of a resilient city turns on the top-down work that we've mostly focused on, but also equally important is the awareness, readiness, participation of individuals, families, neighbor to neighbor. Without that, what we know now from California, from our emergency services, they made an announcement just a year ago that climate has changed sufficiently that the existing emergency operations systems and infrastructure, they can no longer guarantee the safety and protection of the people. Literally translates to, in many cases now, and you're seeing it across the United States, hurricane after hurricane and in fires, it's neighbors who are saving neighbors because the magnitude of the events is far beyond the ability of emergency services to get there and respond. So this gets personal. Each and every person in this room has a family, maybe has kids, maybe has parents, who may be at home alone when an event happens. Whether or not they are saved has everything to do with the kinds of communication, planning, and discussions you have with your neighbors in your communities. Also think about it. Every human is a tremendous sensor. If we're enabled, informed, inspired, we can sense what's happening. But we tend to leave the millions of us out of the picture, which then tends to set us up for greater and greater numbers of victims, which doesn't have to happen. So as we deploy, the bottom-up side means really putting energy into both educating and informing the public. People have the capacity to understand, and when they do, they're able to respond. Encouraging and supporting neighbor-to-neighbor communication and effectiveness. So one, when a major event happens, people will be able to save and protect each other. In California during the fires, it was literally a matter of 30 seconds to a minute that people had in the middle of the night to sometimes, if they had not met with their neighbors before the fire, and in the Santa Rosa fire, 10,000 homes burnt in a couple hours, many people were killed. If they didn't know their neighbors and they woke up to the smoke, if they didn't know them, if they waited 30 seconds or a minute to knock on the door or break a window to wake them up and get them out, sometimes that was a matter of life and death. These are the kinds of things we may be facing with landslides and other things in this community. So the ability to have people save each other is important, but also the last piece of this is that it is possible to enable members and people throughout the community to also be first responders. One of the big issues with the last typhoon was trees, branches down all over. Not possible to have enough government people out on the roads quick enough to clear the branches. But many people have chainsaws, garden equipment, or could be trained by local fire officials or road officials, deployed with chainsaws, so you have people throughout the community who can respond quickly to make sure those roads are open so other emergency services are available. So this is just a glimpse of how we can be safe. People want to help. It's in our nature. We need to enable them to be part of the whole team, and we could have millions of helpers. That will be the key to lowering damage, increasing survival, increasing hope.
Perhaps what we need to do in Hong Kong is reimagine our extreme high density living. Unlike in Los Angeles, where people mostly live in houses, we live in very tall apartment blocks. Maybe we haven't even begun to think about what it means in the Hong Kong context for people in the community to help out. So I think the last two typhoons probably gave us some ideas, and this is a new area of thinking that Hong Kong can go into. I'd like to invite two more people to just give very short intervention. One is Daniel Krieger to talk a little bit about the retuning of our capacity to understand climate, and then Thomas Tang to give us a very quick briefing on what took place in our discussion about philanthropy. And then Natalie can maybe also give us a very quick summary of the discussion about vulnerable communities, because these are different from the hard science, but they're very essential for our community to move ahead. Daniel, please.
Thank you, Christine. And thank you. Is this picking up? Okay. Thank you, Christine, and good morning. And I apologize, I'm a little flustered this morning as I've been suffering from a migraine. But when you think about climate change, if you think about it in the context of we're entering into a world that looks a whole lot different than the one that we've been in for the last several decades. That was happening concurrently to technology changes, globalization, security changes, even public health changes. But all of those things are being magnified and accelerated and impacted in a very significant way by the rules of the planet that we live on changing. And as a result, the way we interface with this planet that sustains us is going to have to change. So if we think about, for instance, if we think about an architect, if you design a building that is conceivably going to be around for 50 or 100 or 150 years, it's not just about the footprint of the building, but it's also thinking about how is that building going to experience its surroundings and be impacted by its surroundings, by the environment, over its lifespan. And if you model based on what the world used to look like, as opposed to what it's going to look like, then you're designing a building that could very well fail. And when it fails, its owners, its occupants, those who surround it are all going to be impacted. So when you think about what it means to be an architect or a planner or civil engineer, or somebody who's making finance decisions that will have decadal implications, multi-decadal implications, you have to think about how can we account for the world we're entering into. And that's a different skill set than the one we had before. So when we think about many occupations, now we're thinking about the context of what's the delta between the skill set we used to have and the skill set that we need to have to be healthy, secure, and prosperous all at the same time. So when we think about climate change, we think about climate change as a combination of a human capital issue, a governance issue, and a behavior change issue. We're going to have to collaborate across organizational boundaries and jurisdictions in ways that we have not been accustomed to doing, because Mother Nature doesn't care for organizational boundaries and jurisdictions. Water is going to go where water is going to go. And so as a result, we're going to have to think about what organizational change and cultural change looks like while we're embedded where we are. So this is the ultimate challenge, but it's one we can take on, because when we take on in numbers and using systems thinking, as Christine said earlier, we have the capacity to redesign and reconceive what we are going to be. And so that's the opportunity that sits before us in a changing planet, to be in front of it as opposed to reacting after it changes. Thanks, Christine.
Thomas?
Thanks, Christine. Good morning, everyone. I know there's a lot of familiar faces here, and you know me in different guises, but on Saturday, I had the privilege of working with the CARe Foundation and representing them in terms of the dialogue on the role of philanthropy in climate change. And I think it was a very interesting discussion because a lot of people didn't know what philanthropy would to do with climate change. I think that was the first issue we had to resolve. But having got past that, it was really about connecting, because a lot of what's happening right now, as highlighted in the earlier slides, is the disconnect between different parties, private sector, government, and the NGOs. And in a way, philanthropy and foundations, which was the one that we were focused on, acts as a kind of bridge, to bring different parties together on a fairly neutral platform. I think the word about de-risking political issues came up more than once this morning, and really that's the theme of it, because there is no agenda. Other than the fact that there's a humanitarian objective at heart here, which really is what lies at the core of a lot of philanthropy. The traditional models of philanthropy were challenged. And, when we looked at things like poverty alleviation, education, healthcare, medicine, etc., a lot of these things were what foundations are typically concerned about. So, in a way, there's also an onus on foundations to change the way they think about the whole concept of climate change, because climate change does touch on all those three issues that I just mentioned. So the outcome of that was that we looked at three things. One, the new model for philanthropy, which really talked about how it acts as what someone very nicely coined catalytic capital, because there is a lot of capital out there which needs to find good projects. And the idea was that if these projects are still out there, which frankly are either too risky for the private sector or not the right type for government to support, then there is a path there for philanthropy to step in. The third thing was on climate literacy, because this really speaks to something that foundations are very interested in terms of literacy and awareness. Not just at the kind of educational level, but really it's a kind of public level of bringing people to the same point of understanding of what the implications of climate change are to society. And I think the last point was that in terms of the broader perspective on the Greater Bay Area, how foundations actually can work across boundaries, which I think is something that sometimes challenges governments and sometimes challenges the private sector, but there is this notion that foundations can bridge that. And it does remain that it is about cross-sectorial. It's about the systems thinking, which was highlighted earlier. We do need to think on much broader horizon. And some of these messages, some of these objectives can be fulfilled by philanthropy, working very closely with the different parties.
Thank you, Christine. Good morning, everyone. I had the privilege to facilitate a group in the last couple of days to discuss about and actually explore the connection between climate change impact and the vulnerable groups, the grassroots community, the impact on the grassroots community. We had a pretty engaged discussion in the last 2 days, and we had also a few social and environmental NGOs with us, which was particularly helpful in the whole discussion. So I think to summarize our discussion, we have three thoughts along in this area. The first is we feel that in our discussion, we feel that we don't really have a clear understanding on the additionalities of the climate impact on the grassroots situation. So what is the additional impact of from climate change on the livelihood, on the living environment, on maybe the sufferings of the grassroots community? So we feel that we haven't got that clear understanding on the impact of it. So we feel there may be a need or an opportunity for us to explore more through research or through more engagement, between the social and environmental NGOs and the community, to understand more about this, so that it can point towards adequate policy support or planning process for us to have a more resilient city. This is one thought. Another areas is we feel that like from the feedback of our NGOs is that actually we feel that the community doesn't really have enough understanding. Like in a highly dense city in Hong Kong, with like more than 1 million people that are living in like under the poverty line. So what does it mean for them, and how can they enhance their own competence, and how can they be more adaptive to the increasing adverse impact of climate change? So and we also feel that like the social NGO and the environmental NGO, they are very much like into like driving the issues in their own space. But then to speak back to like the earlier on what Christine talked about, the system thinking. So there are opportunity for more collaboration, more cross-sector understanding between the social NGO and the environmental NGO. And there may be opportunities for them to work together in order to help the grassroots community to enhance their well-being, to make them more resilient in facing climate change impact. Thank you.
Okay, our last point before the Q&A, I'd like to invite Professor Chi from Beijing, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the greater Bay Area and the opportunities there.
Thank you, Christine. Good morning, everyone. Greater Bay Area means very different things to different people and communities, of course. It may mean greater economic opportunities, the more interactions across culture and society and communities. It may mean the greater regional integration. It may mean a greater political influence. But from the perspective of climate change, it certainly means a much intensified economic human activities. And the way we're going to build this develop the Greater Bay Area in the next decades, if not longer, will have a huge implication for climate change. And therefore, we as a community definitely have a much greater responsibility to think how we're going to build this Greater Bay Area, how we're going to invest, and what kind of output, what kind of outcome and impact we're going to have. So this is this I think not only for our business community but also for our government, non-government, academic communities. The Professor Zhang just asked a very profound question, I think quite relevant, whether or not Greater Bay Area is a high climate risk region, and his answer is definitely yes. Because this is an area we have a higher probability and much more vulnerable than most of the areas. And it is a very high exposure to this climatic extremes. And it's also a high value that can be lost to all of this. And therefore, to respond to this high risk, and we have to have a systematic thinking and response. And climate risks, there are direct climate risks as we discussed earlier, and these risks can actually propagate to across the border, to across the all the boundaries and borders. Professor Gibson just talked about fish does not recognize administrative boundaries. So does the climate risk, and therefore there is a necessity, for different regions to come together, and different jurisdictions come together to deal with this the systemic climate risks. We also know this climate risks can actually cascade along these different lines to different domains. Well, so therefore there's a necessity for all of the different domains, the different areas and sectors to come together. And finally, this is and we should take this climate change as an opportunity. So a point was Magnus in the discussion highlighted, and there, when we are doing this response, building the greater Bay Area, there are greater opportunities for us to take the leadership, right? How we're going to build a green, low carbon, low impact, and highly resilient and sustainable Greater Bay Area actually present a huge opportunity for all of us to take the leadership. When I come to Hong Kong, especially when listening to your response to this typhoon Mangkhut, I was very impressed. You have demonstrated a huge resilience, a great capability to deal with this the climate extremes. And I also know together, we can build a much greater resilience and much greater community to all these climate risks. And therefore, the responsibility, necessity, and the opportunities, are the things we really should look at for this development of Greater Bay Area. And for sure, we're going to have a different version of development for this great initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, the next 45 minutes is yours. Please share whatever questions, ideas, comments that you may have. And we actually have pretty much our entire group here. So any science questions or technical questions you want, not only the people that you just met through their presentations, but our other speakers are also still with us. Any ideas that you may have, please share them with us now. Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Drew at HSBC. A specific issue that I think has been covered by most speakers, actually, that starts with a specific question to the climate and weather scientists, and thinking of the wind speeds that we saw with Mangkhut, which, from my memory, were 200 kilometers an hour plus when they got to Hong Kong, which in turn was about 15-20% faster than we saw with Hatto a year earlier. Do the weather and climate scientists, what is the prospect of those wind speeds continuing to increase? And then perhaps to the engineers, how close does that take us to the design standards of things like windows in our buildings in Hong Kong? And then what does that mean if we do get close to those design standards in terms of the next set of data around injuries and life loss in Hong Kong, business days lost? And if so, what do we do? How do we take action now to prevent some of those consequences?
Well, so I think we have two types of question. One is we need a meteorologist, and the other one is we need somebody, not from our team, but I know there are many of you here who are built environment experts about the standards. So amongst the, amongst the meteorologists, would Alexis like to have a go? About the wind speed, right? There was a specific issue about local wind speed.
Well, I guess
Please stand. Please
okay.
Stand. Come up.
I guess the wind speed up to this point, we see the rising temperature. With the rising temperature, looking at the storm that hit Hong Kong already is not at their peak speed. If they maintain this type of increase in wind speed, by the time they get to Hong Kong, I would still expect there would be speed that is stronger than what we have seen now. But what is the limit? There must be a limit. What is the limit? I don't think we have a resolution yet. I don't know whether other colleagues in this area can have any information. But the trend, increasing trend, I think we would expect to continue a little bit. But what is the scientific limit? I don't think I have any idea.
Any contribution, Ruby?
Yeah, so I can speak to that a little bit. So, in fact, talking about the theoretical limit of tropical cyclones, it is very much related to the sea surface temperature. So how warm the ocean is relative to the upper atmosphere. So the difference between the two create the energy for the tropical cyclones. So there has been quite a lot of research by Professor CARe2018 from MIT, and they did actually derive that upper limit. And we know that it is going to increase in the future, mainly because of the rising sea surface temperature. So the wind speed that you talk about, we expect that to happen more frequently in the future. So the total number of tropical cyclones, we don't expect to change, but the number of intense tropical cyclones, we expect to increase.
Yes, please.
Just one point, real quickly. It's not the wind speed is not the only thing that does the damage. People compare Typhoon Mangkhut to the Hurricane Florence in the east coast of the United States, the South and North Carolinas, and that one's much lower speed and did much more damage. And 19 deaths from the initial report. So I guess it is important to put all this together. Right.
Did you want to add something here on this point?
Well, in the context of the storm, so to Professor's point, you could have a storm that rolls through quickly, does a lot of wind damage, and has virtually no water. I lived through Hurricane Andrew. I'm from Miami. And that storm in and of itself resulted in a complete transformation in building codes in Florida because we were unequipped for it. But at that point, the hurricane completely leveled the area that it went through with 180-mile-an-hour sustained winds and gusts in excess of 225 miles an hour that could have been well in excess of it, but they knocked out all of the infrastructure that could measure the wind speeds. So we actually don't know how much more than 225 it went to. That's miles per hour, by the way, not kilometers per hour. Okay, so do the math on that if you know the metric system better than I do. I'm American, I'm sorry, we fail at metric system. That's why we created our own dumber system. So the second, so if you look at Hurricane Harvey in Houston, you have the opposite of it, where the hurricane stood over Houston and then just dumped rain, and it didn't move. And Houston gets 50 inches of rain per year. They got 50 inches of rain in one storm. And so that's a completely different set of parameters. And then you have Florence, it's kind of a hybrid between the two. The response is building codes. So in Florida, after Hurricane Andrew, we put in hurricane-proof windows as a requirement for all new structures. And then there were also some building codes related to roof attachments to homes and such because roofs were flying off during the storm. You don't want to be doing that afterwards. You have to model this out now and think about what a long-term transition to that's going to be, because the cost is going to be significant where you're looking at retrofit. But you also have to make sure that all new buildings are going up thinking of that.
Right. So I know there are many building engineers here. Who would like to just brief us very quickly on building codes? I'm looking at you, CS. Yes, Mr. Ho.
Well, I think there are a lot of experts within this room who can actually speak with greater authority than I do. But, well, as a building profession for so many years, say 30 years and so on, so I think I just share what I want to share with the room here. I think in terms of science, I think around the world, many experts already developed some sort of model, for example, simulations, and so on. What are the factors that can affect the building sort of safety? I think I heard a very good term during yesterday's conference. So we're talking about not just wind, but also about, say, the water, so the water content, the soil actually melts and so on. So I think it's something, as you mentioned today, it's an integrated sort of system thinking. So we have to take all those, I would say, results that we already have over these years regarding that kind of climate change, and then we can do some sort of, I would say, predictions. I think we are a lot of experts just to do this. I think there's no difficulty for the building profession to follow. That's to say, once you, this is what we say, we get what we measure. So once you show the index, you show the parameters and so on, I think everybody will fall in. And then government, I think, has no difficulty.
How about the window, right? I think because we lost, well, some buildings lost quite a lot of windows at Mangkhut. the building code, right, for windows, who can help us with that? Is our building code strong enough, or do we need to strengthen Hong Kong's building code?
Well, I think apart from standard, I think people have to realize one thing. If you want to have something good, which can actually withstand that kind of disaster and so on, actually talk about three things altogether. So the number one is the design. The number two is the use of materials. The number three is the workmanship. And you can look around, the code is just the same. But some building appears to be more susceptible, right?
Yeah.
Some windows seem to stand all this so well. So when we talk about the code, the standard, and so on, we just talk about the first thing. What is the design, and also what the material used. I think everybody use the right material. But perhaps if you look at one of the I would say the building serious attacked by that sort of problem is, I think just one weakness can actually destroy a lot of window. I believe just one of them breaks, and then actually the bit actually fall, and the wind will use it as a bullet, and then shoot on the other windows. So in other words, you're not making just one or two windows to cope with the code, but everyone. So we talk about certification now. We talk about the verifications. I think one of the trouble is we have a standard with the code, but afterwards, everybody claim, I do it, right? But at the end of the day, whether they actually do it right, in terms of the design, in terms of the workmanship material, I think we have to put in more, I would say, verification process in the system so that we know that nobody can escape at the end of the day, that everybody will self-policing.
But it seems like that the building code is all right, because the vast majority of our buildings, the windows are fine. So then
I believe so.
So it's down to the other points. Even stronger, yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah, that's right. So, any other questions, comments?
Mike Kilburn from the Airport Authority. Just a question on the failure of weather gauges prompted me to remember that in our last typhoon, the sea level weather gauges failed at several stations. And of course, for the airport, this is important because sea incursion into the airport is a serious matter, and we know that it failed somewhere above 2.9 meters at Chek Lap Kok, but at other levels at other stations. I wonder if there's someone from the observatory or makers of equipment who know what might have caused that and what can be done about it, so we can accurately measure storm surge in the future.
Anyone can enlighten us on this very specific question? Because if not, we can probably find somebody to answer that question after this conference. Anyone? No. Let's move on to other thoughts that you may have. Yes.
I'm John Chai from BEC. Wearing a different hat today. One of the actions that you've highlighted, Christine, and through discussion with the panel is the multilateral action at the government level. And we knew that a little while ago, at the government level, we have a key action being undertaken to establish task force and whatnot. So learning from recent experience, okay, can someone from government update us on what is happening at the government level regarding multi-department actions and whatnot? Thank you.
May I ask CEDD to share with us some of the work that you're doing? You're leading a study within government on the infrastructure side. And then I think we have the steering committee chaired by the chief executive. Maybe Mr. Jay can share that with us.
Well, I think one important thing is information. So CEDD is now helping Security Bureau to develop a platform which is called COP, Common Operational Picture, we share among the various rescue department regarding the landslide information, traffic condition, flooding, tree fall, etc. We hope we can launch the platform, I think in 2020, so we can have first-hand information to help people to the rescue team. Well, I think it's important right now.
Right. I think on Saturday, Mr. Wong, our policy secretary, has already mentioned that, within the government,
the Chief Secretary of Administration is chairing a steering committee to coordinate all the matters concerning climate change. Yeah, and actually the committee has pulled together all the bureau secretaries as well as heads of departments together, because climate change was an issue which crossed all the policy areas. Yeah, and this Typhoon Mangkhut actually has give us many lessons. Yeah. And as Christine has said, that as you have observed, I think the preparation is quite good, because I think because our Hong Kong Observatory, they make very good forecast, and all the departments were geared up to prepare for the coming of the typhoon. Yeah, but we found that the damage caused by this typhoon has never been happened before in this city. And therefore, the aftermath, we have encountered a lot of problems and issues. I think some of the trees, in some areas, has not been cleaned up. Even as today, it may take several months to do so. And therefore, the chief executive has assigned the Secretary for Security, to take a good review of the preparation, the handling, and the aftermath of this typhoon incident. And we believe we will be learning a lot from it there. And as to, I think, design codes, etc., I think a colleague from CDD has already mentioned that, they have a manual on that. And I think in the future, if we get more information and more lessons, I think the review process will be a continuous process. Yeah, and thank you.
Any other questions maybe for government for further clarification or any other issues? Yes. Andy.
I'm not sure when I got introduced. I'm from the nonprofit NGO sector, so I founded an organization called Tree People, which is working to work with government, but really engage and inform and support community responding, which I implied. And I just wanted to underscore what you touched on in a really big way, which is the role of philanthropy. The definition of philanthropy is the shortest distance between pain and suffering and solution. Government is slower to respond, but as humans, our job is to open our hearts when we sense pain and suffering. It takes much longer time for institutions, especially in government, to sense and respond to the need, where philanthropy can fill that gap very quickly. Thankfully, and as a visitor, guest here, I'm so impressed of philanthropy's role in supporting this this conference and the growth of the universities around town. But I really want to underscore, thank those of you who are here, and encourage you to reach out to your peers who aren't here, those in the philanthropy community, because you really can, as was said, but it just needs to be underscored, this catalytic investment to be sensors of where are the gaps, where is it need to be filled, and you've got partners across the room. But thank you for being here. Your role in advancing and stimulating a more rapid response cannot be underestimated. Thank you.
Anyone else, or perhaps any of our overseas speakers from different parts of the world? Anyone? Yes? Yes.
So climate change is the greatest challenge that we as a species have faced and are likely going to face. And so I wonder 100,000 years from now, when our future generations of whatever species exist on this planet look back on us, if they're going to look back on us the way we look back on Cro-Magnon and other species of human existed, and they're going to tell the story of how we either overcame this challenge or succumbed to it. And my hope is that in telling the story of how we overcame it, that we found a way to evolve in how we function as societies, as institutions. And I think that story of opportunity starts with places like Hong Kong that are uniquely positioned to be leaders because of the intersection of cultures and societies that exist within, which enable a sort of collaboration that is much more difficult to take place elsewhere. I've said this a couple of times this weekend. Hong Kong is a place where East meets West in a way that happens nowhere else in the world. I live in Miami, which is a place where North America and South America meet in a way that happens nowhere else in the world. And that means those are opportunities for Hong Kong to come forward, not just in embracing its own challenges and opportunities, but also helping everybody around and to be the beacon of that sort of leadership. There's an immense amount of wealth here, not just of financial wealth, but of intellectual wealth, of human capital wealth. And that opportunity to be a beacon of light here is one that should not be ignored. And so when I think about the slides that you presented on the Greater Bay Area Collaborative, I would even extend it beyond that to what is the role that Hong Kong can have in global leadership here, in convening stakeholders across this continent and in going down into Australia, and as an epicenter. And I think that is an amazing opportunity. But it's going to require one for folks to look down at organizational silos and boundaries and say, yes, we need to maintain our capacity to govern and lead, but we also need to maintain a capacity to make the sum greater than the whole, the whole greater than the sum of the parts. We have to stop functioning as sum of parts, and that's the opportunity that sits before us.
Thank you. Mike?
Thank you. It's a very nice lead up to my question, which I would like to focus, see if we have some time today to figure out how can the owners of big public infrastructure assets talk to each other and talk to government to strengthen our overall adaptation and resilience. I think that's a very big and open topic. Obviously, as the airport, we have systems for planning, managing and recovering from typhoons, but we also need to properly understand the risks at a systemic level, for example, with the power companies, with the railway company, with the other providers of assets, town gas, the bus companies, and so on. So I know that just coming into this conference, that was one of the key objectives, was to see what platforms or ideas for further collaboration may come forward. So just would be very interested to hear of maybe others in Hong Kong, either from government or the private sector, who would be interested to work together to try and set out a framework and then begin addressing some of these issues.
This is actually a question that had been put to me at different times, both before the conference, during the conference, and now after the conference. You know, we live in a very tight town, and we kind of know everybody. But it seems like key stakeholders, both in and out of government, are calling for what Mike has just asked for. But we have everybody's telephone numbers, right? So what is it that you need? Because I've always thought that you all have amazing convening power. I mean, if Mike called up and said, you know, this is the airport, you got to come and talk to us, you know, we want to make things better, and I'm going to call up the power companies, I'm going to call up the government, and we'll all have a meeting, I'll be the first one to put my hand up and say, okay, I'm there. So what is it that you need? What is it that, why is that not happening? How can we make that happen? Because you're all here.
I think in the discussions in the workshop, one of the points that came up was our organizations are all very big. Everyone has a different role to play. And quite often, the decisions that need to be made for a certain topic would lie with another colleague or another area. And we don't know all the colleagues in even our own organizations sometimes. So somehow, we have to figure out how to get the right people together with the other right people counterparts, so maybe there is more synergies, as Daniel had mentioned. That's first. And I think secondly, how to empower the experts, in making decisions sometimes, because quite often, you know, we are in a very hierarchical society, and there is this expectation that all decisions have to go back up to the top and, you know, be made sure that it's sound and it's kosher. But then, you know, in moments of urgency, the best person who knows the answer actually is probably the best person to make that decision instead of necessarily waiting for someone else to say, yes, this is the right recommendation. That's another point. But the third one, I thought, also going back to, you were saying convening power, but I think also it's the knowledge sharing is very important. And I think, number one, we want to have more opportunities for more platforms so that the right people can come together. But even more important, we need the right information to be prepared ahead of those discussions, that people have had the time to actually go through information that probably required years of research. And this is where I think in Hong Kong, we probably need to go back to look at how academia's role can support a lot of this decision-making that needs to be done, and which is why I think it's great that HKUST has convened this conference.
Any other comments here? Because I think this is a kind of common problem, right, for all of us.
Yeah, I'm Edwin Tong, I'm Director of Drainage Services. Actually, I want to make another comment here. People always think, oh, disasters are bad, okay? It's really ironic to say that we take some positive effect from any disaster such as typhoons. But we do have something here. We have two typhoons, super typhoons, Hato and Mangkhut, in 2 consecutive years. I just look at my own experience. I was at Tai O, a low-lying area in Lantau, and before the last typhoon, Hato, hit Hong Kong. People who know Tai O is a low-lying area in Lantau, and we have built, CEDD helps us to build a seawall to protect village houses there. But whenever there is forecast of typhoon coming, because of the sea level rise, we have to put in additional 500 millimeters demountable sea flood walls on top of the concrete sea walls. But even that process needs a lot of help or cooperation from local villages. There are gaps that we need someone to evacuate their properties and put some water barriers up there so that the whole street is being protected like a polder scheme. Before Hato came, I went there, and not everyone are so cooperative. But after Hato, everyone knows that this is very important. So I won't go to the extent to say that this is a blessing in disguise, I mean Typhoon Hato, but it did help us to prepare better for Mangkhut. I was there on Saturday, Mangkhut hit on Sunday. Everyone in Tai O is geared up because of the experience, the bad experience of Hato. They are very cooperative to us building the additional demountable flood barriers to protect their village, okay? And the point I want to make is this Typhoon Mangkhut, or Typhoon Hato especially, has raised public awareness on disaster, on how to prepare better for ourselves. Our colleagues said that we are better prepared for the Typhoon Mangkhut. I think it's better prepared because of Typhoon Hato, the bad experience of Hato. And so I'm quite optimistic that we people in Hong Kong are learning fast. We learn from each disaster. After the experience of Mangkhut, we understand the COP is being set up. We have a review on our aftermath system, how to deal with this emergency. I think your problem, Mike, I think you can talk to everyone now, and everyone is going to listen to you and try to solve each other's problem. We don't really need a platform. You can call up CLP, you can call us up, you can call up HKO, and I think everyone is going to cooperate because of the experience of Mangkhut. So I'm quite optimistic that in a society like Hong Kong, we learn from experience. We try to do better. Even if a typhoon which is stronger than Mangkhut, I don't think we have a very big problem because what we learned from this particular experience here. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, so I mean, I got from that the learning is very deep, and we need to be better organized. right, and ask the right questions of the right people. But I see a number of hands. Can I show 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Let's give a chance. 6. All right. Can I have people who haven't spoken? Yes. Please, Winston, who's come from Singapore and was a speaker at our conference.
Yes.
Please.
Morning, everyone. Is this on? Yep. I'll say a few things about maybe the Singaporean perspective of how we try to address issues of climate change. I'm from the National University of Singapore. Thanks again for inviting me to speak at this conference. I'll say 3 things. One is to rebut maybe Daniel's point about Hong Kong being a global city. I think some Singaporeans might disagree with that. I have to stand up for my country. Yeah. Okay. But we share similar things. While we aren't exposed to the sort of severe storms like what everyone here in Hong Kong has been subject to, we are also subject to other similar issues pertaining to coastal cities, sea level rise and extreme heat. Now, one thing that hasn't been stressed enough so far, I think, is that time is limited. Urgent action needs to be done. Urgent action needs to be coordinated at multiple levels. And I'll give 2 examples of work that I've been involved in Singapore to that particular end. I'm leading a sort of multi-stakeholder initiative trying to cool Singapore, coolingsingapore.sg. That's the sort of the project. More information on that project, you can look at that website. But what we're trying to stress is we're trying to reduce the urban heat exposure, both from severe heat events and from the urban heat island, which Hong Kong is also subject to. We find that a lot of the methods, the approaches, both engineering and nature-based solutions are already there. What isn't present, however, is the coordination between agencies. So previous speakers have mentioned about the need to think beyond silos, to think across disciplines, to coordinate your actions. There is impetus at the top, at the Singaporean level, to understand this environmental issue. There is impetus from the bottom, but most oftentimes the entrenched level of resistance in terms of applying these concepts, be it engineering or be it green infrastructure, lies in the middle. There's a lot of thinking that says like, this is not my problem. It doesn't add on to my key performance indicator. But I think once we address that through either communication, through education, that can be resolved, and that can be resolved quickly. That's what we're doing in Singapore. The second thing is that other industries within cities, be it aviation, be it transportation through maritime industries and so on, they have to get on board as well. But one industry that hasn't been mentioned so far is tourism. Lots of people come to Singapore to visit for tourist purposes. Same in Hong Kong as well. But I think that people from these industries that may not have been, highlighted often in terms of climate change adaptation, climate change resilience, they have to come on board as well. In the Singaporean perspective, one of the key attractions is the zoo. The agency that manages that, Mandai Park Developments, they put their money where their mouth is. They put in close to $500,000 for academic research pertaining to sustainability, pertaining to environmental awareness, pertaining to climate change. They approach academics like myself to lead this sort of applied research towards how do we best address knowledge to our visitors who come to Singapore to visit these sort of parks, to visit the zoo, to let them learn more about climate change, not just for Singapore, but from a global perspective as well. So there is that encouraging actions that are aware of the urgency of climate change within Singapore that maybe folks here can learn, and similarly we can learn from you all as well. Okay, so yes, we compete with each other, but
that we're going to educate our visitors. What a good idea! Yeah.
Thank you, Christine, and everybody. So my name's Ben McQuay, and by day I'm a lawyer, but I'm here to speak just for a few moments about the Hong Kong Green Finance Association, which Christine very kindly plugged a moment ago. As people will be aware, the carbon reduction commitments that governments made in Paris in 2015 will cost trillions and trillions of dollars. And as you may also be aware, governments themselves can afford just a small fraction of the cost of the cleanup. And so therefore, mobilizing the private sector through the international financial centers is a huge and important imperative. And so our Green Finance Association exists in good part to try to help mobilize, to try to help educate private capital in this very important area. And although we have a large number of tasks and objectives, one of them is, and one of them that's relevant directly to this discussion, is how we create a greener financial system in Hong Kong. Now, you may be surprised to know that one of the greatest challenges that we currently have is pipeline, i.e. there's not enough investable qualifying projects and products. And so I don't have a question for you, it's more of an RFP. And that is, to the extent that you have ideas, you have thoughts, you don't know how to structure, you don't know how to fund, you know, get in touch with us because we might be able to help you, because we all need to collaborate, which I think is a message entirely consistent with previous speakers. Thank you.
There were some hands at the back of people who haven't spoken. Yes. Someone who hasn't spoken? Yes? Yes? Okay. Well, I'm just trying to, yes, yeah, no, I'm just trying to make sure. Okay, so we have Robert and then Thomas. Robert, please.
Thank you, Robert Gibson, UST. How far in the future should we look when we plan major infrastructure developments? For instance, when you put in a new MTR line, I'm told that the sort of payback period on that sort of investment to make sense is something like 100 years. But if you put it into a new area of the territory and that leads to a town, what sort of length, what duration into the future should we be looking at for that? And then that comes to the question of what scenarios on sea level rise should we be planning for if we are going to do, as is proposed, have a major development, which I personally support very strongly. I think it's a great idea, a major development on an artificial island between here and Lantau Island. How do we address that problem? How far do we look in the future? One possibility is to say, well, look, we know sea level rise is going to happen. We don't know how quickly. So let's do a scenario planning. Let's do a scenario planning for something which is a pretty high level and see how would we cope for that, and then have that built into design. I'd be really interested if anybody's got any comments on that.
I think this is the sort of thing that CEDD will have to do. Is that right? Don't know whether you want to talk a little bit about the process, right, of will you be able to share something with us?
Well, actually, I'm not an expert on this aspect, but I think we should have setting up a team to look after this kind of issue, different scenario, including increase in sea level, because it will affect the subsequent works, including our design standard, etc. And well, perhaps I can share with you my expert area in landslide. You know, in 2008, we have experienced a very severe storm on Lantau Island. I think one of the speakers have mentioned before. And looking back, you can't really rely on the government adaptation measure. That is the engine measure. We have to gear up our community. So the trend is like that. We would like to have some kind of innovation technology, try to use this to have for example, landslide detection system to set up an early warning so as to mobilize the community to give them the first-hand information. And we are going to educate our community, the self-help tips, not solely rely on the rescue team, but we can help each other, the neighbors, the community itself. So I think this is the trend of the government approach on this aspect. Yeah.
I think that's a really important statement, because some of the government departments have already embarked on not just the hard engineering, but a total package that engages more people in education and so on. But I think Robert's question, it's all right not to answer it today, because I think what Robert is really saying is, if you're going to reclaim anything, make sure you take care of sea level rise. And sea level rise might be more or faster than we think. I think that's what's behind Robert's question. Yes.
Maybe I can supplement a bit. Because of AR5, the new forecast of the temperature, the effect on sea level rise, both our department and CEDD colleagues have revised our manuals. Our manuals is the stormwater drainage design manual. CEDD has a port work design manual, which deals with the sea level rise and how we design sea walls, levels, and so on. And not even that. Because of the mangut, our two departments are also looking at the effect of mangut. One would realize that apart from heavy rain, storm surge, we do have a third problem. That problem did exist in Hatto, but not as severe as in mangut. It's the overtopping wave effect. In areas like Hang Fa Chin, South Horizon, and some other areas, the sea level has not risen to overtop the seawall, but the wave did. The waves sometimes are 3 stories high, and they hit on the ground and destroy the promenade and so on and so forth. And I understand the CED colleagues is now working on a consultancy to look at the coastal area, how we are going to deal with storm such as these effects, overtopping wave effect and sea level rise as well. So that's why I said that we are all learning from each incident and we are trying to do better for the next one. Okay.
I think the other thing is, and don't forget what the director of the Hong Kong Observatory said on the day one, on the 27th. He actually said that we were lucky with mangrove because the prediction was in fact much worse, but it didn't hit us as severely. So I would imagine that within government, these estimations are all taken into account when they are now thinking about setting standards for new infrastructure. Anyway, the directors are all nodding their heads. So, maybe 2 last question comments because we're hitting 11:30. Thomas, and Thomas, and then we'll finish with Natalie. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. I'll be real quick on this. I may have given you the impression that I work for a foundation, but I actually don't work for a foundation. But in facilitating the workshop, I learned an awful lot about what foundations and philanthropy do. So there's 2 points, really. One, to speak to the gentleman's point about sustainable finance. Actually, foundations will sponsor and will fund certain projects. I mean, there's always the impression that foundations have deep pockets, which is partly true, as I found out in my research. But the fact of the matter is that an alarming statistic was that only 2% of global philanthropy is spent on climate change. And I think part of the reason underlies a lack of understanding and also lack of presentation in terms of what the projects that are being presented to foundations. So it really does rely on that level of understanding to bring people together and connect in the right way. The second point, real quick, is this thing about climate literacy. I think it's great that all of us in this room here, and we have a very common point of understanding about climate change. But outside of this room, I would challenge that there's not a lot of people who share this understanding, except for the point that a gentleman from DSD made: when your house gets flooded, then you know all about climate change. So I think if this one actually speaks to the role of philanthropy, because really it's a very natural extension of what type of work they do in terms of education, public awareness, and humanitarian kind of development. And picking up on Richard's and Daniel's point there, boy, I wish we had a community like LA and Miami, because from what the tales you told me, especially Richard, in the early tales of what happened in Los Angeles, when communities suddenly realized they had a problem and got together, that really opened doors and opened hearts.
I have an invitation for everyone here. In the last 2 days in our group, discussing about the potential impact and additional impact of climate change on the vulnerable groups, on the underprivileged community. So thinking about people living in subdivided flat apartments, like in a small confined space, facing more extreme heat and more extreme cold. Thinking about the more frequent storm and more severe rainfall, like the impact on shelter homes on rooftop and so. So we feel in our group that we don't have enough understanding about the issues, about the impact on these underprivileged community. And we just know that they have less resources on hand, like when they face these kind of challenges to try to remedy the situation, the aftermath of it. So there are quite a passion within the team, a few of us, wanting to go beyond the conference, wanting to explore more, whether through research to understand more about these issues. So if there are academics in the room that you would be interested to have a dialogue to work together, I would love to chat with you. Or if we have, we of course need funding for this kind of research. So if we have philanthropy funds here, like I would also love to speak with you. So it's an invitation for everyone that like we feel there will be an opportunity for multi-stakeholder engagement, a dialogue to try to explore these areas, to try to help the underprivileged community to become more competent, more resilient in facing the climate impact.
Well, I can completely conceive of a project where we can already use existing knowledge about weather, climate change, risk, and so on, that could be funded by the foundations that could be taken to the community. The vulnerable groups never come to gatherings like this. And I think we do have the responsibility to consider how to outreach to them. And we need to work with other people in the community who are in touch with them. So thank you, Natalie. If there are no final comments, then I'd like, oh, CS? Okay. From Beam Society, built environment expert.
From being, I would say, just a member of the community, I think we are talking all about prevention and so on and so forth. I think actually we are talking about the maintenance of the city and also development of the city or the community. We perhaps emphasize so much on the proactive approach. But I think today we have to think about the reactive even more. The reason is very simple. The whole thing actually changed too quickly. Just now you mentioned about the standard. No matter how the new standard is good enough, as I mentioned, but they only take care of the new buildings and the new built environment. But what about the old one? Actually, they are actually at the back. So no matter how good you are, so somewhere, somehow, they will fail. So rather than thinking about how we prevent the whole thing, raising these and that, I think we think about the reactive measure. For example, you look at the internet world and so on. You can see that everybody seems to be working on their own self, but there's some sort of unseen hand, which is what I say the coordination. So we're talking about coordination at different level. Now, for example, whenever there's any disasters happen, I heard about the television interview on the one the old lady living in Leiyuan. And people, the reporters say, why don't you go? Oh, no problem, right? Whenever I have a problem, I just call the police. They will come. Now, that is a problem because they're too passive. They over-rely on one single authority, just like the sea to save you or God to save you. It doesn't work, no, nowadays. So you have to rely on all sorts of, I would say, mobilization of resources, as mentioned by the speaker, How. For example, if we mention about the roles of different groups, for example, CS, you're going to take care of not just your wife, your children and so on, but what about the next door, the elder ladies? So once something happens, and then once you blow the whistle, and then the whole thing will work. So at the end of the day, it's still the well-being of the people. And we want to protect the property, but so much more to protect the people. But if we have good coordination, good definition of the roles, and then who to make the decision, and also the information center resources and so on. Now, before the manga, you can see that a lot of advice through the internet. My wife actually using that kind of plastic wrap for food to put on the window. I say, Winnie, what you're doing? He said, well, according to I got a video. He said, putting something. I say, it is so plastic. How can it hold the glass? If somebody hit the glass, it broke. The plastic cannot hold it. So all sort of rumor around the city. So I think what the government can do is actually to give information. And then I would say mobilize the majority. Wow, there's nothing happen. I think we have to get prepared for the worst. No way we can prevent anything. As an engineer, I tell you what, I've been asked, right, Mr. CSO, can you guarantee, about the reliability, for example, the lift and so on? I said, as a scientist, an engineer, I tell you what, it will fail. It will fail. But I just try to reduce the frequency, that's all, and also the impact. But not just the engineering solution. I think human solution is even more important. I'm so glad to hear about, say, the Los Angeles sort of experience. I say, yes, I think that is a solution.
Well, thank you so much, because I think you've reminded us of the old areas in Hong Kong, not the new buildings where the codes are very old. This notion of how we can help each other, and also the spread of news sometimes through the internet is not correct. And this bit about putting things on the window, we know that that's not actually the right thing to do. And I think we also have property development companies who are managing buildings, how to reach out to, who can reach out to different stakeholders and communities and families in society. So it is quite complex. Who can act? Obviously, many, many people can act. So I hope, if nothing else, we've triggered some thinking, and that you could take through your own channels and network what you could do. I think government is thinking about many, many things right now, maybe better connections. I think, Edwin, despite your willingness to take a lot of calls, you actually still hear major stakeholders like the airport, the railway, the utilities, actually saying they like to talk more. So what are some of those platforms that could be created soon for enhanced discussion? And I think on behalf of HKUST and the academic scientific community in Hong Kong at other universities, I'm sure there's more that we can do to organize our knowledge in a way that could be more easily shared. And I'm delighted to hear from the philanthropic sector that they might fund some of this. So let's see what we can do going forward. And at HKUST, we will continue to see how we can work with all of you. So thank you very much. Thank you to the sponsors. Thank you for government to be our partner.